I think we've all been there. You're leaving the movie theater after seeing a promising sequel to one of your favorite films, disappointed that it was just the blatant cash grab that you hoped it wouldn't be. The old saying is truer than ever. The sequel is never as good as the original. Although we know that these films will most likely be inferior to their predecessors, we've been conditioned to keep coming back for more. While nowhere near the extent of the now franchise-reliant movie industry, the world of musical theater has produced sequels from time to time. The concept is the same as that of films. Take a successful existing property and find a way to stretch every last cent out of it. The few musical sequels that have made it to Broadway, or almost made it to Broadway, have flopped hard, which is a phenomenon that is unique to musicals. Standard sequels to popular films almost always exceed the grosses of their first entry due to enhanced audience interest and a built-in fan base, but not for musicals. Aside from Frozen 2, even Disney avoids the problems that come with the sequel musical film, as noted by nearly all of their classic property sequels being banished to a straight-to-DVD release. In this video, I'll explore a few of the most famous, or infamous, modern musical sequels, and try to figure out why most flop so hard. In the early 1980s, the original team of Bye Bye Birdie reunited to write a sequel to their Tony-winning Best Musical from 1960. Composer Charles Strauss, lyricist Lee Adams, and book writer Michael Stewart all returned to bring the characters of Rose, Albert, and Conrad Birdie back to life in a story set 20 years later entitled Bring Back Birdie.
I want to know about, this is the first time it's ever been done on Broadway. They revived a show and made it a sequel. And it takes the story years after.
Oh, yes, it's 20 years later.
And
it's
what happened
Rosie
to
and
everybody?
Albert 20 years later. Their two kids have grown, well, they're 15 and 16, and it's the problems with their two kids rather than the McAfee's children.
And where's the
and
Roxanne?
Conrad Birdie, well, Conrad Birdie's now about 44, 45. He's fat. And he's now the mayor of a town in Arizona, and he wants to be a respectable person. But what he has not done was he hasn't really gotten rid of that gold suit. It's stuck away somewhere.
That was Chita Rivera, who reprised her role as Rose from the original musical, blissfully unaware on the Merv Griffin show of what was to come with Bring Back Birdie. Donald O'Connor also starred, replacing Dick Van Dyke as Albert Peterson. On paper, this show promised to be a runaway hit, a top-tier creative team with big stars and a pre-existing property. The production even bypassed an out-of-town tryout, cementing the idea that it was ready to take Broadway by storm. After the first preview, however, theatergoers knew that was not going to be the case. According to critic Peter Felicia, who was in the audience that first night, quote, "End of Act 1, lights up, silence from the crowd, and then a low-pitched but loud boo. I've never seen or heard an audience go from love to hate as quickly as it did in 1 hour at the first preview of Bring Back Birdie." And it wasn't just the audiences who despised the show. The actors on stage did too. New York Times critic Frank Rich wrote that the cast seemed tired and that they'd abandoned hope. One night, Donald O'Connor forgot his lyrics and dejectedly told the chorus boys to take over, saying, "I hated this song anyway." Bring Back Birdie officially opened at the Martin Beck Theater on March 5, 1981, to overwhelmingly negative reviews. The most common issues with the show were its unfunny book, as well as its bland score that seemed to either poorly mimic numbers from the original or inexplicably venture into genres like punk and gospel. The sets and costumes were also lambasted as tacky and reminiscent of a discount appliance outlet with a stage full of TV monitors. As always, Chita Rivera was a bright spot, even earning a Tony nomination later that spring. Unsurprisingly, the show closed a mere 4 performances later on March 7, 1981. Chita Rivera recounted years later that, quote, "The flowers were as fresh going back across the stage as they were coming. That's how fast it was. It lasted a weekend. With the first modern Broadway musical sequel behind him, composer Charles Strouse surely learned his lesson, right? Unfortunately, he didn't. Strouse was also the composer for the hit 1976 musical Annie, and returned with nearly the entire original creative team to create its sequel, Annie 2, Miss Hannigan's Revenge. A sequel to Annie had been teased since its initial success, and again at its closing in 1983, so it was only a matter of time until Annie 2 would schedule its DC out-of-town tryout and subsequent Broadway opening. Even before rehearsals began, advertising and marketing for Annie 2 was everywhere, leading to a respectable advance of $3 million. The media was abuzz following the search for the next little girl who would play the iconic red-headed orphan.
Broadway's new Little Orphan Annie, 11-year-old Danielle Finley. Already, the former Little Miss Missouri beauty queen is the feature subject of a profile in Life magazine. After competing against nearly 400 other would-be Annies for the role, Danielle has a theory why the part of Annie fits her to a T.
She's very lovable, she likes to cheer people up, and that's the kind of person I am. And also, she got to live with Daddy Warbucks, which was my favorite part, because she got to be rich.
The plot of Annie 2 changed many, many times during its DC run, but mainly focused on, as the title says, Miss Hannigan's Revenge. Picking up weeks after the end of the original musical, Miss Hannigan tries to wreak havoc on Annie's new life when it's revealed that Daddy Warbucks must marry in order to continue on as Annie's adoptive father. Miss Hannigan, either imprisoned or exiled, it depends on the iteration, plots to disguise herself as a prospective wife for Warbucks and uses an Annie look-alike to select herself as the winner of his marriage contest. The plot was no doubt convoluted and focused on Hannigan rather than Annie herself, but Dorothy Loudon was on hand to reprise her Tony-winning star turn. And as we learn from Bring Back Birdie, a star can save a show with problems, right? Before opening at the Kennedy Center, it was apparent to the creative team that the show had major issues. Charles Strouse, not even a decade out from his last flop sequel, had his doubts, saying that, quote, "I did not want to do this show. I didn't want this piece to be an expression of greed." He was well aware that people would see Annie 2 as an unnecessary cash grab. Book writer Thomas Meehan made sure to express that musical theater is risky, underpinning worries that the show might not live up to its hype or $7 million budget. Annie 2, Miss Hannigan's Revenge, opened in D.C. on December 22, 1989, with a nearly 3-hour running time. The Washington Post headline read, quote, "Annie 2 lacks wit and emotional warmth. Two things that a musical comedy desperately needs." By the time the limited run concluded at the end of January, the show's Broadway future was doomed.
And beginning Saturday, there will be no more tomorrows for Annie 2. The sequel to the Broadway smash is closing after its Washington tryout and will not open on Broadway in March as scheduled.
Unable to let their show die, the creative team insisted that Annie 2 would endure in some form or fashion. After a script overhaul and a new title, Annie Warbucks, which completely stripped Miss Hannigan from the plot, the show set its sights off Broadway.
I see you grin, gotta give in, we're like a mirror when you're gone.
Annie Warbucks opened off-Broadway at the Variety Arts Theater on August 9, 1993, nearly 4 years after Annie 2 premiered. The show received slightly better reviews than its earlier version and managed to break off-Broadway records along the way. However, it couldn't reach even a fraction of the success that the original Annie garnered back in the 1970s. Songs like I Always Knew and Love just couldn't compare to Tomorrow. Not even a year after Annie Warbucks premiered, another show fell victim to the curse of the Broadway musical sequel with The Best Little Whorehouse Goes Public, the follow-up to the 1978 musical The Best Little Whorehouse in Texas. While Best Little Whorehouse never became an iconic show like Annie or Bye Bye Birdie, it was a moderate success in its time, running over 1,500 performances. For the sequel, Broadway legend Tommy Tune returned to direct and choreograph, and Peter Masterson, Larry L. King, and Carol Hall returned to write and compose. Bob Mackie was even brought on to design the showgirl-inspired costumes.
We got a telephone call from our original producer who asked if we wanted to do a follow-up to the original story, which had taken place in Texas. And we all said no, because we were not interested in repeating ourselves.
Nevertheless, composer Carol Hall and the rest of the team followed through and constructed a sequel that only featured one character from the original musical, the matron of the whorehouse, Miss Mona, now played by Dee Hoty, fresh off starring roles in the Tony-winning Best Musicals City of Angels and The Will Rogers Follies. Loosely based on a true story, the plot of Public centers around Miss Mona being brought in by the IRS to manage a legal brothel in Las Vegas that owes millions in back taxes.
Wicked as Sodom and Gomorrah, how can anyone not adore a little town like this, where everything's legal?
While the setting of Las Vegas is an interesting choice that lends itself to flashy sets and visions of showgirls, it was unclear if it would be enough to make the show palatable to audiences. Surprisingly enough, all involved with the show seemed to be very optimistic about its success before opening.
I haven't created a flop Broadway musical yet, and I don't intend to start with The Best Little Whorehouse Goes Public.
I can feel it in my bones that the thing is going to take off, and if you don't get your tickets now, you're going to be waiting for a year.
However, it was a bad sign that producers felt the need to put out a half-hour infomercial on television to try and drive up interest in their $8 million show.
And over the next half hour, we're going to be taking you behind the scenes to feel the emotions, the thrills, the challenges, and the fun of bringing a hit show to Broadway.
The Best Little Whorehouse Goes Public opened at the Lunt-Fontanne Theater on May 10, 1994, to scathing reviews, with Variety calling the show a testament to Broadway hack work with a flat score and a brain-dead book. It was also ragged on for being extremely boring even with a high budget. The New York Times said that your money would be better spent flying to Vegas to see the real thing. But, like Bring Back Birdie, the leading lady, Dee Hoty, did receive a Tony nomination for her performance that attempted to keep the show together.
Now for someone hears this song in Texas, I'm leaving Texas.
After the unfavorable reviews and lack of star power to keep ticket sales alive, the show closed on May 22nd after only 16 performances. The musical sequel all but died until none other than Andrew Lloyd Webber resurrected it in the 21st century with Love Never Dies, the sequel to the most successful musical of all time, The Phantom of the Opera.
I've often thought that we left the original Phantom with a little bit of a cliffhanger, and I thought, well, why not do a sequel to it at one point? What I can say is that it's set in America 10 years roughly after the end of the original Phantom, and it's also set in Coney Island.
As Lloyd Webber mentioned, Love Never Dies picks up a decade after the original Phantom and follows the original characters, but now in America's Coney Island rather than Paris. Time discrepancies aside, the plot basically follows Christine, Raoul, and their son Gustav as they come to America for Christine to perform for a mysterious impresario who turns out to be the Phantom. When the show was initially announced in 2009, Phantom superfans were skeptical, and for good reason. At that time, Lloyd Webber was no stranger to major flops, with shows like The Beautiful Game and The Woman in White barely in the rearview mirror. However, the creative team carried on, with the Tony-winning Jack O'Brien and Jerry Mitchell at the helm of the upcoming London premiere. Love Never Dies opened at the Adelphi Theater on March 9, 2010, starring Sierra Boggess as Christine and Ramin Karimloo as the Phantom. Audiences and critics alike were immediately disappointed, with the New York Times calling the show self-sabotaging and bizarrely unexciting. Not even a year into the run, it was announced that the subsequent Broadway production of the show would be postponed indefinitely. The show also underwent rewrites and restaging well into its run.
Oh, my broken soul can't be alive.
Unsurprisingly, Love Never Dies shuttered in London after less than 18 months of performances. But as the show's nickname, Paint Never Dries, became more and more fitting, the original Australian production premiered with a brand new directing and design team. Thankfully, this reimagined and highly rewritten version was much better received and gained slightly more positive feedback in the US with the theatrical and DVD release of a filmed performance. Although a Broadway production never came to be, against all odds, a North American tour of the Australian version did have a successful run from 2017 to 2018. Ultimately, Love Never Dies didn't flop quite as hard as other sequels, but with an 18-month West End run and a canceled Broadway production, it is still seen as immensely disappointing, especially when compared to Phantom's 35 years and counting. Now that we've looked at the history of the musical sequels of the last 50 years, we have to examine why they flop. The first reason is the most obvious one. It's impossible for a sequel to escape comparison with the original. Any sequel is going to be held to a much higher standard and viewed under a microscope. And since sequels only come about when the original work is popular, it makes the sequel's chances of success that much slimmer. In the case of Love Never Dies, for example, even the creators knew that it would be impossible for lightning to strike twice, or for people to separate the follow-up from the original. Director Jack O'Brien told NPR in 2010 that, quote, "I realized right at the outset that no one would thank us for doing this. I realized that we probably would never get, critically, a fair evaluation because how can we?" Another reason that these sequels don't fare well is the inherent knowledge audience members must have of the previous work to understand or enjoy the new musical. This issue doesn't normally matter when it comes to film. You can just pull up the movie and watch it before a new installment is released. In the theater, however, there are much greater barriers. That barrier could be high ticket prices, or the fact that the original show is no longer running. With sequels like Bring Back Birdie that rely heavily on knowing what happened to the characters in the originals, it would be impossible to enjoy the current action without having seen Bye Bye Birdie. In the New York Times review of Love Never Dies, Ben Brantley makes it clear that if you haven't seen the first Phantom, you will be confused. If a show is impossible to understand without having seen another show 20 years prior, why would you feel compelled to buy a ticket? Furthermore, sequels disrupt the notion of happily ever after or the conclusive ending that most musicals utilize to give audiences a sense of satisfaction. A well-written musical knows how to leave audiences content with what they saw, not necessarily wanting more. This is why the one exception to the flop sequel rule is William Finn's Falsetto Land, the sequel to March of the Falsettos. The first show doesn't end in a definite way and therefore leaves the story open-ended, lending to the combination of the two shows that happened with Falsetto's Broadway premiere in 1992. On the other hand, with The Best Little Whorehouse Goes Public, no one cared to know what happened to Miss Mona after the events of the first musical, and no one wanted to see her in Las Vegas, a far cry from the charming Texas town of the original. In Annie 2, audiences didn't want to see the now adopted Annie be put into peril again. They wanted her to be able to live her new, happy life without the threat of Miss Hannigan's revenge. And in Bring Back Birdie, no one wanted to see heartthrob Conrad Birdie become old and fat. Lastly, it's important to realize that musical theater is ever-changing and evolving, so the gaps in time between originals and their sequels can create shows that seem either stuck in the past or not cohesive with their predecessors. Nearly all the musicals mentioned so far have fallen prey to this problem. With Annie 2, the happy-go-lucky musical comedy was getting old by the time it premiered, over a decade after the original. In Bring Back Birdie's case, the 60s charm of the original was lost when transported to the 1980s. And when Love Never Dies premiered 20 years after Phantom, the sung-through British mega-musical had been out of style for a decade. Conventions change, leaving sequels to walk a fine line between homage and keeping up with the times. It's clear that you can have too much of a good thing when it comes to musical sequels, but, as history has shown, Love Never Dies certainly won't be the last to set its sights on Broadway. While musical theater creators may not necessarily pursue sequels only for monetary gain, it seems to me that they may have lost sight of what makes live theater live theater. Theater is different from film in that it's an art form that's more final. It's an art form that lives solely in the moment in which it's happening. Perhaps a sequel stage musical goes against the nature of live theater itself. Thanks so much for sticking around and watching my video. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe to my channel. I hope to keep creating more videos that explore topics in musical theater that aren't usually discussed and that I enjoy talking about. Feel free to leave a comment with any suggestions for things you'd like to see in future videos. Thanks again for watching.